Okay, folks, back with you in the last part of Unit 1 of AP World Review. We're going to do topic 1.6, and this is the developments in Europe from 1200 to 1450. All right, so starts off with that chart, feudalism, which basically you've probably seen something similar to it for it. Basically, you had king, noble, knight, vassal from top to bottom. The king would provide the noble with land, who would then break up his land and give it to his knights and vassals, who would then have serfs living under him who might get a small parcel of land to farm, and they received protection from the knight. In exchange for that, serfs would provide labor and taxes and food and other things like that. The upper parts of the thing, the knight and vassal would provide his sword and military service to his noble, his local lord, who then would in turn provide money and soldiers to the king when the king went to war. Okay, so that's kind of serfdom in a nutshell. Serfs are bound to the land. They're not. It's a very gray line between slavery and serfdom. They're not really property like a slave is that can be bought and sold. But on the other hand, they couldn't leave without permission of the owner. They're considered part of the land. But after the Black Death, this all begins to break down because so many people die, and doesn't discriminate between rich and poor. A lot of the classes of the nobility die out, and these serfs are left to their own devices, and many of them leave to the cities where there are job opportunities and also freedom. Okay, some of that is spurred by, and some of it goes coincidental with some of the improvements in agriculture. You have the three-field system, which you see an example in front of you where you basically farmed 2 plots of land and you left the other fallow to regenerate. They built a lot of windmills and water mills to grind the grain, and a lot of progress was made in the development of plows. All of these increase food production, which lead to an increase in population, especially in cities, because you have more food. They can afford to cities can afford to go bigger because there is a food supply. All right, brings us over to France with the EstatesGeneral. EstatesGeneral are made up the clergy, who's 1%, the nobility 2%, and everybody else is 97%. As you can see from the picture in the background, it was a real sweet deal for the clergy and the nobility because not only did they get all the trappings of wealth and power, but they didn't have to pay any taxes. The third estate paid all the taxes, and so you can see this idea that the third estate was carrying the first estate. This becomes a very famous cartoon during the French Revolution. Okay, Magna Carta. This is really the first attempt to rein in power of the king. It takes place in 1215 when British nobles forced the king, King John, to sign the Magna Carta. It not only limits the power of the king, but it also is really the beginnings of modern democracy where people are getting rights. Now, originally the rights are just for the landed nobility, but eventually those rights get down to everybody. All right. Somewhat later than King John, you have the 100 Years' War, and this is truly a 100-year-long war fought between the British and the French, really over who was going to be the king of France. Early on in 1330s, there's a death of a king in France, and he dies without leaving a male heir. In France, men only are allowed to become king. But here you have a problem because the King of England is the grandson of the king, is the nephew of the king who died and the grandson of that king's father, but he is the son of the king's daughter. He lays claim to the throne, as does the nephew of the other king, the nephew of the king that died, the brother. It's a another crop of the grandfather's family. Um, and so there's a big long war fought over who should succeed to the throne, and it goes on for the better part of a century. It does have some fallout. It leads to really a decline in chivalry or knights. Really, it's about military tactics. You go from these huge mounted knights to more of an infantry and archery based army. Leads to the establishment of both strong national identities in France and England because they're no longer as intermingled as they once were. It leads to a revolution in military tactics, as I said above, and you start to have the introduction of gunpowder into the battlefield. But probably the most significant piece is it really brings about the end of the feudal system because men went to war and made names for themselves and were rewarded and often freed from their binds of serfdom. Okay, biggest piece of the puzzle in this era is still the Roman Catholic Church. It is the dominant organization in Europe at that time, and it influences all forms of parts of life. In education of art, you have the monasteries and the churches really charged with educating the masses, and much of the art of the period is commissioned by and for the churches. As I said before, under church and state, the church is the most powerful institution in Europe. It's also the wealthiest. But you begin to have a competition going on between the kings who are rising in power and the church. And as the kings grow more powerful in their own countries, they become to rely less on the Pope. And eventually you have a trade-off where the church provides legitimacy. The king is crowned by the church and anointed by the church. And in return, the king protects the church within his country. But he also gets some influence over the church. At the same time, you have the monastic life coming on. It's really the religious way of life. You begin to have monasteries cropping up all over the place. They're both a place of safety as you come out of the Dark Ages, but they were also the repositories for knowledge and literacy, so they also gain a lot of power and wealth. And then on top of this, and this is really more towards the very end of the period, as the Renaissance unfolds, which we'll talk about in a minute, it challenges church power and people become more educated to begin to question the teachings of the church. And you begin to have this challenge to the Bible being written in the local language, which means the people can read it. Maybe they don't need the church as much. Part of the time frame of this area is the Crusades, and the Crusades had started before 1200, and the big push was the Crusades. The Pope promised anybody who went on Crusades, which I talked about when we were looking at Islam, the promise of eternal salvation and also the promise of land. Two crusades are mentioned. The first crusade, which was really the most successful, they captured Jerusalem. Gradually over time they lose all that, but they created several Christian kingdoms that for the better part of 150 years had a pretty strong stronghold in the area of what we might call the Middle East. The fourth crusade is really the one that takes place during this time frame, at least of any of the crusades. It results in the sack of Constantinople. Basically it's a argument over pay, and the Crusaders decide to take the money from the Byzantines, and then they stay and rule Byzantium for the better part of a half century, and this really ends any chance of reconciliation between the Eastern and Western churches. All right, this period is a time of economic and social change. You have Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant, travels to China during the rule of the Mongols. He wrote a book about it, and it really develops into a growth of trade along that. On the social trade, we've already talked about the end of feudal system. You have the beginnings of the risings of a middle class, and you start to have a really vibrant society growing up where you have a blend of Greco-Roman culture with the native German and Celtic cultures. Cities begin to grow. With the end of the plague, people move from the countryside to the city for more opportunity. The growth in agriculture helps us, and the leaders of this are really the city-states of Italy. Jews continue to be persecuted. They were blamed for the plague and expelled from several areas. Muslims have a little bit of a rollback during this time, at least in Europe-wise. It will turn around the other way in the next period as the Reconquista of Spain takes place, with Christians driving Muslims out of Spain. And in gender roles, there's early on in this period, there's a lot of opportunity for women who become active in many of the new urban professions, including the convent. But men will eventually reassert their authority. Okay, that brings us to the Renaissance, which is really the golden age of Europe. It's a rebirth of learning. It's driven by a desire to use reason to solve divine and natural mysteries. It starts really in Italy, centered on the city-states, inspired by the Greeks and Romans, leads to a huge outpouring of growth in art and literature. Gradually, it will diffuse into Northern Europe, and some of the most famous parts of that are the Dutch painters, Rembrandt and some of the others, and English literature with the writings of Shakespeare and Erasmus. Okay, Russia begins to coalesce, first under the Kievan Rus, influenced heavily by the Byzantines. It spawns down here in Kiev, and really gets its strength from the 19th century conversion to Christianity and its Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And as Byzantine weakens, Russia grows in strength in response. And then you've got the Mongols, who conquered Eastern Europe, including Kiev and Rus. They really facilitate the trade and cultural diffusion from China and Asia. And they're seen both as a threat and a counterweight to Islamic expansion, because the Catholic Church see them as possibly a group that you could convert. And they were also equal opportunity conquerors. They conquered a lot of Islamic territory and didn't really convert, at least early on. All right. So that is what you need to know about Europe. I'm going to leave you with just a picture of the Mongol Empire so that you can see just how far into all the areas they got. So now you need to finish the last part, the 1.7 comparison. That has a lot of detail from that you'll pull from the other sections, and I will schedule a day where we can get together online to discuss.